Welcome to Bears on Tap, hosted by Kyle Juice Machalski, Quentin Q. Crisco, and the one and only Ron Luce, bringing you all the news, analysis, and opinions on the charter franchise, Chicago Bears.
What is going on, folks? My name is Quentin Crisco. I am joined here by the man himself, Ron Luce. We are Bears on Tap, here to talk about the Chicago Bears tight end rooms and their offensive line today. And Ron's ready in his name, analyzing the Fat Boys. He's primed for this one. How you doing today, Ron?
I'm good, man. I was born for today's show. This is the show that I enjoy the most. It's the Fat Boys. Once upon a time, I wanted to be a tight end when I was younger because I had pretty good hands for being a big guy, and I was like, "Yeah, I'm going to be a tight end. It's going to be awesome." And then in high school, they were like, "No, you're too big. You're going to go play O-line." I almost, fun fact, actually, very few people know this. I was almost converted to tight end in college because they were testing out some big boy packages with having kind of some blocking tight ends, and I was one of the smaller offensive linemen on the team. So they're like, we're gonna give you a try. So for like 2 weeks, I thought I was gonna be a tight end in my college days, and then they quickly were like, "Nah, this doesn't fit our offense," and I got hurt along the way too, and it was a big mess. So this is what we were born to do, baby. It's tight ends and O-line. I'm so ready to talk about it.
Every offensive lineman has had the thought cross their mind of
1,000%.
I could play tight end.
It's tight end or fullback. Hard. Yeah, it's tight end or fullback. It's one of the two.
Yeah, but let's just jump in on this, get our graphic up here and rolling. And starting off with tight ends. And I just last week we mentioned Jonathan Wood's wide receiver article over at the Bears blog. And we seem to be on the same schedule as Mr. Wood because
love that.
He put out his tight end articles this week. And I was just skimming through that before the show. And man, he made an interesting point in there that I want to point out, that Shane Waldron's tight end 2, tight end 3 are usually blockers more than receivers, whereas Gerald Everett is the opposite, right? Gerald Everett is much more the receiver. He's going to play some in the slot, be able to put him out wide, be a motion man, all that type of stuff. That really, Waldron's time in Seattle, his backup tight ends were inline guys. And his number one tight end was more like Everett, more like it was like Noah Fant, right?
Right.
Guy who's more receiver than blocker. So Jonathan Wood made a point in his article that, maybe, just maybe, Bears didn't think they could get Rome Odunze. And they said, we need another receiving weapon here. Receiver market is crap on the free agent market. And we're going to go get Gerald Everett, and we're going to use him as our number 3 receiver of sorts, right, within heavy formations and all that good stuff.
Sure.
And they end up getting Rome Odunze because it almost feels like, looking at the Bears weapon group, there might not be enough targets to go around for these guys' career averages.
No, it really does feel that way. I know you and I talked about that a little bit when we focused on the receiving room just a week ago. And that's an incredible point that I really never considered, because it is very easy to look back on we'll call it just the Shane Waldron timeline of teams that he's been with. It is a lot of that second tight end is more of the blocking guy. I can think back to, the earlier days probably in Seattle, right? The Will Dissleys of the world being the number 2 tight ends. Whereas a guy, like you said, like Noah Fant is the perfect example of your move around, more athletic tight end. Almost makes me wonder, would the Bears ever have considered in this draft, one of those guys that we were like, oh yeah, he's more of a move around guy, more so than he is an inline guy. And maybe they would have had they not signed Gerald Everett. So I think that's a great point that we maybe never considered with that signing pre Mr. Wood's incredible insight. I love that idea, that thought process, because I think he's onto something, especially because you have that familiarity with a guy like Everett. They know exactly what they are getting with him because of Shane Waldron's experience in 2 different places with a guy like Everett. So crazy to think about that could have been the case had Rome not slipped to number 9 there. That maybe Gerald Everett was the third highest targeted guy in this offense. When we're looking back at this come January, February of 2025.
Yeah, and so I think it's a perspective that we lose a lot as fans of saying like,
100%.
When you're going through free agency, some of these cap move trades like Keenan Allen haven't happened yet. They signed Gerald Everett before they got Keenan Allen.
Yep.
They thought they could get Keenan Allen, I'm sure, but it wasn't a sure thing. It was far from a sure thing that they'd be able to get him. And it's before the draft, so you don't know that you're going to get a Romo Dunze. So you're just saying, man, we need something next to DJ Moore who can catch football. Like,
I think that's such a good point too, really quick. I don't mean to cut you off, but like football is the only major sport where the draft happens after free agency. And it's very unique in that essence. And obviously a lot of the other sports you look at, right? Like they have a development system behind them, right? Hockey has the AHL, NBA has the G League. The Major League Baseball has 4 levels of minor leagues, well, 5 if you include rookie ball. The NFL, yes, of course, there's the XFL, but it's not quite the UFL, but it's not quite the same, right? Like it very much is like these guys typically are stepping in and making contributions right away. At least high picks are, right? First rounders, second rounders, maybe even a third, fourth round guy. Sometimes you get lucky and a Braxton Jones starts as a rookie, right? I think, it really was at the time, right? Like, hey, we just need to get weapons in the building, and then let's see what we can do between kind of where the unofficial end of free agency, when like things start to teeter off, kind of a week and a half, 2 weeks after it starts, and obviously the kind of the dead period in between that, and then with the NFL draft as well. So agreed, though. Great point, and it just something that we have to keep in mind. Where like the NFL is the only league where the draft comes after free agency.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge difference maker in looking at this. And as I was reading that, my brain started turning a little on, this isn't the first time we've seen that either. Last year, we saw them go sign Deontay Foreman.
Yep.
Polls said after the draft, we did not think Roschon Johnson would be there where they got him. Deontay Foreman kind of didn't have a place on this roster until injuries gave him a spot,
And he took the hell of advantage of it and ran with it, literally.
Yeah. But getting more specific to the tight ends, part of me almost, as I've, I wrote the tight end or the running back article, last week we talked about running backs and wide receivers. I wrote the running back article doing a little more digging on stuff. I wrote the receiver article doing even a little more digging on stuff.
Shameless plug on TechSports.com. Sorry, continue.
Correct. And then never apologize for pushing my writing, right? Never. I'm a huge proponent of that. But as I was looking through all that, I'm getting more and more the feeling that Shane Waldron, I mean, I think he likes to use tight ends, but I don't think his offense is necessarily tight end heavy, you would say. I think his offense is much, and we alluded to this some of the last episode, but his offense is much more what it needs to be for the personnel he has. And that's really the vibe I'm starting to get on it.
And I agree with that. I think the best, especially for the common Bears fan that's kind of listening along to this, that maybe isn't as familiar with the X's and O's and doesn't watch a lot of film and probably didn't watch a lot of Seattle Seahawks games just by nature. Think back to how pissed off you get every year in fantasy football when you draft Noah Fant and he underperforms. Like but that's exactly what I think of, right? Like at least over the last couple seasons under this Shane Waldron / kind of Dave Canales offense that they had there in Seattle, it featured a lot of tight ends, right? You would see Will Dissly and Noah Fant on highlight reels throughout the course of the season, but it's very few and far between, and it got people hyped to the point where if you're a fantasy football player, you would start to commit to those guys. I remember considering picking up Will Dissly on a number of occasions to be my number 2 tight end, only to get pissed off and drop him 2 weeks later because he puts up 2 and 3 points respectively in 2 meaningless games. So I think you're 100% right, especially when you take that mindset of it, and then you couple that into, right, what we talked about last week with that illusion aspect of the Shane Waldron offense.
Yeah, and I mean, so I had something and I lost it. This keeps happening to me. I had something and it just disappears.
It'll come back.
But anyways, I think that we are going to see more 11 personnel than we saw from the Seahawks the last few years, just because I do think he has 3 really strong receiving options here, and a Keenan Allen who might be a bit more typecast into a slot role. Whereas, he played almost 70% of his snaps last year, 60% over the last 3 years in the slot. It's kind of where he produces, where he's most comfortable. I think it's about 60% of his targets came there as well. So a pretty even ratio, but I do think that you're going to lean into that a bit more early in the season, probably. And then as the season progresses, you might get more heavy because you're saying, okay, we can trust Rome to do a little more, which is actually the opposite of what I think I said last week, where I think you'll see Rome's, I guess, the Bears' usage of 11 personnel grow as the year goes and Rome gets more comfortable.
Yeah.
I almost think you might see Keenan Allen. And like I said, this runs counter to what I just wrote 2 days ago, but you might see Keenan Allen playing more of the heavy personnel snaps early in the year. But as the season grows, you're seeing them just get more into the lighter personnel because they trust Rome there at that point.
Yeah, 100%. And fake ball coach here in the comments. Hey, coach, how you doing? It's like he says though, and this is a great point to bring up too, right? Like I think this absolutely went into the conversation with getting a guy like Everett as well. It's just tight end as a rookie quarterback's best friend, right? You look at what the Carolina Panthers tried to do last year with Bryce Young, bringing in a guy like Hayden Hurst to be that, that kind of safety blanket. The Bears have done it in past years with other tight ends that they brought in. Remember Trey Burton being the big signing, right? To be that cushion in year 2 for Mitch Trubisky. Like it really is true that sometimes just having a tight end that runs a 5 or 6 yard pattern and is a quick check down type read for a young quarterback, if he sees something he doesn't like, that can be his best friend, especially like you said, right, Q? Like early on in the season, maybe they are a little more heavy more often. And that allows for the tight ends to get involved and be those checkdowns for Caleb. And maybe just as Rome gets comfortable, maybe just as Caleb gets comfortable, that's when it starts to thin out a little more. And maybe the tight ends get used in different ways as the season progresses.
And I found what I was looking for earlier in my head. A lot of it too is kind of weird. Like when you're talking about the production of Noah Fant, or like from a fantasy perspective, Waldron rotated these guys a lot, like you'd see on like a defensive line or a running back room, where like no tight end on their roster played over 600 snaps last year. And I do think Cole Kmet will be much more of a permanent aspect in the offense than you've probably seen in the past in Seattle. But I do wonder if there is an aspect to this where he's saying, we rotate our tight ends because they don't rotate their linebackers and safeties. And that gives us an advantage to have fresh legs on the field when we're attacking, and to be able to rotate through guys as blockers too, to keep their legs fresh. And obviously you got to avoid falling into the pitfalls of that, which is telling your play call. When, this guy's on the field, you have like 70% chance it's a run versus this guy, 70% it's a pass. But I feel like he probably has a system down for that, or a pretty good idea of how to avoid that. And that's something that I think is a bit innovative in concept, where, we see it with running backs. You want the fresh legs on the field because they're going to blow by a defender that the guy who's had 20 carries to this point in the game might not. And I think there is some validity to that with tight ends when you're talking about a scheme that is going to ask them to deceive a lot and to be able to beat a man coverage guy off play action and not lose that step he gains, right? That half step, not losing that, can be all the difference in the route.
And you'll see it with receivers as well, right? Like if a guy runs a 50-yard go on consecutive plays, he's probably tapping out for the next play to get a quick breather. That's when you used to see the Josh Bellamy's of the world, right? Get onto the field, because it really is just to keep those legs fresh. If you do it with receivers and running backs, why not do it with a tight end position, who is kind of the one hybrid position on the field where you are asked to do the job of an offensive lineman at times, but you also are expected to be a pass catcher and be an athlete as well. So that's really, really strong insight, Q, especially with the numbers to back it up as well.
Yeah. And so right now the Bears have essentially 2 tight ends on their roster, right? They got Cole Kmet, they got Gerald Everett. Steven Carlson's there. He really isn't a guy who has, I think he's played like 100 snaps in the last year or something like that. And then I believe they have one or two other players on the roster. I'm actually going to pull it up.
Is Jake Tonges still a tight end on the Bears roster?
I do not believe he is.
Oh, that's tragic.
I could be mistaken on that, but I did not think that he was. I don't remember seeing his name through all this roster playing with I've done. So they got Tommy Sweeney, who's played a little bit, was a 7th-round pick out of Boston College back in 2019, and then Brendan Bates, who's a UDFA out of Kentucky. Mm-hmm. So really, you have nothing proven behind your two guys. Everything from there is just whatever you get is bonus. And they, truthfully, those 3 guys probably much more fit what a backup tight end for Waldron has been. An unknown blocker, like the guys against are a little more known than this. Right. But if they feel like one of these guys can be a serviceable blocking tight end, that fits the same role there.
Absolutely. Nothing to add there besides to agree with you, Q, because there was always that third tight end that you saw in Seattle that you're like, this guy's been on the field a little more than I would have expected.
Right. And so one of the questions that I have looking through the tight ends here is, where does Kari Blasingame fit into all this? It's a fullback, not a tight end. But
it's a great question.
You're already looking like you might carry 4 running backs. If you're carrying 4 running backs, you need to cut some from somewhere. Could that be the tight end 3? Where they're saying Kari Blasingame is our essential tight end 3, even though he's a fullback?
I think that's very plausible, because when you sit back and look at what he's done, right, there was the same confusion with a guy that you and I both appreciated in Ben Sinnott, who was this all-around tight end that was confused as a fullback. In a lot of aspects, fullbacks and tight ends are very similar players. I think the biggest difference is a lot of fullbacks are just bigger running backs at the end of the day, but they are asked to do a lot of the same things. I would be hard pressed to believe that Kari Blasingame's a worse third tight end option than a Steven Carlson per se. So I think it's very possible that that's how they function the roster with, hey, Kari Blasingame, you're tight end 3 if we ever go, 13 personnel. But, when it comes down to it, when it's all said and done, like you can also, that's the perfect opportunity then to give different looks. You can motion that guy to the backfield and let him become the fullback. You could arguably do the same thing where if you wanted to get really cute and fancy, you could do the same thing with a Gerald Everett or a Cole Kmet as well, where, just because they're coming to the fullback, position doesn't mean they can't still be used as a pass catcher as well. So I like that idea. And that's definitely something that is a curious aspect of the roster construction that we'll have to keep an eye on as August comes and goes.
And I look at it last year, Blasingame, 119 of his snaps came in the backfield of 396 total snaps, or I guess that's including special teams. 119 of his 186 came in the backfield on offense. But he also had 33 in line, 11 in the slot, and 23 out wide. So it's not something that's foreign to him to line up in those tight end type spots. But looking at the top 2 guys, Cole Kmet and Gerald Everett are very different football players.
1,000%.
A lot of similarities in their yards and their target rates, but after that, it changes quite a bit, because you see Kmet's a guy who has always been right at or below average on yards after catch per reception, except for 22. In 22, he had a really nice year, but that was created by a few big busts, if I remember correctly, where he just had like 60-yard touchdowns because someone just completely blew their assignment.
But wide open.
Yeah. And, play action created it too. It was nice play action concepts that made that happen. But outside of 2022, league average for yards after catch per reception from a tight end is 4.9 yards. He's been at 4, 4.1, and 5 the other 3 years. So right at or below average. He doesn't have wiggle. He's not a guy who's going to get away from tackles and then be able to keep going very far, because he's just not that fast and not that loose or flexible of a player, right? He's going to be much more, he gets to his spot, he catches the football, and he goes down type of player. Whereas you look at Everett, each of the last 5 years, he's above the league average in yards after catch per reception.
Yeah. And I think too, you even think about the build of them as players, right? Like Everett just physically looks like a big receiver versus Cole Kmet, who, you know, Madden always does the guys dirty when you look at their build. Like Cole Kmet looks like a barbarian in the Madden games. But that's just kind of his build, right? Like he is a true quote unquote traditional more tight end, right? It really is like you have here in the notes on the graphic. You know, Kmet being your typical Y, where it is Everett who's more of your your tight end, your move around tight end. There's different variables and verbiage for it depending where you go. But I think sometimes having guys that can do both though is good. Like Everett can give you a little bit in the blocking scheme as you need him. He's not as good of a blocker probably as Cole Kmet. On the flip side, right, Cole Kmet can be a receiving threat. We've seen it time and time again over the last few years with the Chicago Bears. But at the end of the day, he is more built to be the inline guy, and he can help in that run game. And he's probably more best for your check downs and your short routes over the middle versus Everett, who you might be able to get out in a little more space because he has that ability after the catch. So I think having two guys that do very different things, but are overall good enough tight ends to do kind of everything that's asked of a tight end is good, because you're going to be able to confuse defense and give astronomical amount of different looks to these units that you're going to face over the course of 17 games.
Yeah. And it's surprising when I look at some of these numbers, like the contested target rates, they're almost equal, really. Which is shocking, because you would think Everett would be creating many more of his targets would come in uncontested situations, where you'd think Kmet's would be the opposite. And Kmet's actually been each of the last 2 years above average or better than average as far as being able to find targets that are not contested. So I think a lot of that comes down to scheme, if I'm being honest. And this is almost making me rethink what I'm looking at in contested targets per reception, because there's not really a world where Everett should be separating worse than Cole Kmet, right? Just based on their player profiles and their route running abilities and their physical profiles.
Yeah.
But the last 2 years, Kmet has been significantly better at it than Everett. And Everett's been in, probably some questionable offensive systems that are just much more pass heavy than Kmet is. And Kmet's being able to create this separation from the play action concepts that they're playing, while Everett has been with the Chargers under Kellen Moore. Last year was the OC, and I forget who it was the year before that. But offensive systems that were much more pass heavy, much less play action involved.
No, you're spot on. And I think that too, like that also could play into some of that element of just, Cole Kmet's getting open because Justin Fields was such that threat in the run game, right? In Los Angeles, everybody knew Herbert was throwing the football. Eckler wasn't the running back that was going to strike fear into people in the running game, and they really didn't have anybody else like that, which is interesting because now you look at that roster after, a new head coach comes in and, Greg Roman's hired as the offense coordinator. Now they're set up to be quite the opposite. You have guys like J.K. Dobbins and Vidal, who maybe has an outside chance of being a late round running back that turns into something there. You have a Gus Edwards there, right? Like it's expected to be bruisers, and they took Joe Alt with their first pick in the first round. So I think a lot of it too. Sometimes it is just hard just to look at the numbers and say this is what it is. Like a lot of it is too just the situation that these guys are in, because how often was Justin Fields looked at as a running threat, and the Bears were the top running offense in football in 2022. Naturally, the defense is going to key in on that. That's going to get Cole Kmet wide open if things are schemed up properly and the bootlegs are there. I mean, you established it perfectly. I feel like in 2022, Cole Kmet got a decent amount of yards, but they were chunk yards because he was getting those 25 and 30-yard plays downfield versus your more traditional offense where a guy's maybe getting a 5-yard pass and getting 2 or 3 yards after the catch.
Right. And the last number that I'm keying in on here, because it's such a vast difference between these two guys, is the missed tackles forced per reception. I mean, Kmet's forcing a missed tackle 1 every 10 receptions, maybe. Well, Everett's doing it 1 every 3 to 4 receptions. It's just so that really speaks to the difference in body type here. and the difference in skill set, to me, that's what speaks the loudest on both these charts, is that Everett is forcing almost triple the amount of missed tackles as Kmet is on a per reception basis, which is just a wild number. Now, Kmet is going to give you much more in the blocking game. So this isn't to try to sit here and say Everett is better than Kmet. They're different types of players. If I had to choose one or the other, I'm taking Kmet, because your ability to be multiple with Kmet is much wider. But Everett, just that missed tackle number really shows you what he is as a receiving threat and his ability to do stuff after catching the football. And his ability to me, missed tackles, forced per reception also speaks to your ability to get open against man, because you are making people miss. You are showing the body fluidity and the joint flexibility that you need to get open within that number.
And on top of that too, Everett is essentially everything that like Kmet is not, to be like just one step away from the best tight end in the league, right? Like he gives you that little bit of difference that Kmet doesn't have. But I agree with you. I would still go Kmet as well. I think just as a complete tight end, he's the more complete package in terms of skill set. But when you look at the numbers and you say $17 million invested in playmakers at your tight end position for this year between these two guys who really, if you think about it, complement each other incredibly well. It feels like a wise investment by Ryan Poles and the rest of that front office to go out and add a Gerald Everett, who, again, not just from the familiarity standpoint with Waldron, but just from the skill set he brings, complements a guy like Cole Kmet and some of the things that maybe Cole's not just the greatest at. Maybe this also helps Cole be better, because teams have to respect a guy like Everett if they're both on the field, where in the past it was Cole Kmet or bust largely, even though they did have the Jimmy Grahams of the world and Rob Tanyans of the world out there in the last few years.
You know what's surprising that we don't see more often in the NFL?
What's that?
Teams trying to get two Cole Kmets on their roster.
That's a good point.
I mean, and this isn't to say that Cole Kmet is the level of receiver or route runner that either of these guys I'm about to say are, but Gronk and Aaron Hernandez were so similar in so many ways that you couldn't key in on one or the other depending on the situation. And that's part of what made them so deadly, was the fact that you could run to either side equally. You could pass to either guy equally, and you just had defenses scrambling to try to pick up the tracks from that. And it's odd that teams so often go for the counter of Kmet versus Everett, and they want the variety that gives.
Right.
But I almost wonder if you might be better served going for the more mystery you get in alignment and in personnel of having two guys who can do both things equally. And that's not to say I'm not trying to say Everett is the wrong fit here, because I get it. I understand why you want that variety in the room, but it's just, I'm just interested as to why you don't see more teams go after guys who are solid pass catchers and solid blockers to fill out an entire room.
Yeah, I wonder if a lot of that true 2Q, try taking that 10 times fast, is just the nature of like NFL offenses, right? Because so many teams want to be spread that you really maybe only want one guy that's better suited to be an inline guy on your roster. Whereas I think if you look back to your example, right, of Aaron Hernandez and Rob Gronkowski in New England, like New England very much ran that old school pro style offense where two tight ends was a commonality in that scheme. And I think that's why it was so deadly, was just because that's just what their offense was. They didn't have the elite receivers, right? It was it was Julian Edelman who was great, but you would always have those kind of guys that came out of nowhere, the Chris Hogans of the world, and some of those guys that were complimenting.
Wait, the lacrosse player?
That. Yeah. Like it was those guys that complement more so. And obviously they still wanted to run the football, even though they still had Tom Brady in the room. So I wonder if a lot of it is truly too just related to scheme, because maybe we sit here, right, and propose that question. I look at a team like the Chargers, I think is the perfect example of a team that maybe does take that type of thought process and run with it, because that's just Jim Harbaugh as a football coach, right? I think a lot of it is just scheme and how these offenses are designed nowadays with more spread concept is there's less room for two inline tight ends per se on the roster than there was, even just 10 years ago when guys like Hernandez and Gronk were dominant in the league. And maybe we see a little bit of a comeback that out in LA. I think that's the team. If you're going to key in on that, that's the one. Yeah, them too, especially now with Bowers and with Mayer both in that room too.
Bowers is probably more receiver, but like he has more tenacity as a blocker than most receiving tight ends that you
find. And you can teach blocking. Like, let's just be honest. If you can pick up the technique of it and he's enough of an athlete, he can become a better blocker with proper coaching.
Yeah. Whereas it's just a question of how physical to play it. To me, like for a tight end prospect, is do they have the want to throw their hat in the ring at the line of scrimmage, which isn't. I don't blame anyone who doesn't want to.
Right. That's how you get your brain scrambled around. But no, you nailed it perfectly, Q, right? Like if the guy's willing to do it, absolutely. They can become a good blocker. And that's a great point too, right? Because you look at that Raiders receiving room, it's largely Adams and Myers, and there's not a lot else there. Maybe that two tight end look does get used quite a lot with a guy like Gardner Minshew at the helm. And, they get both of those guys heavily involved in the offense. So a couple of case studies we've got to propose with your idea there, Q.
Right. So I think we got to get back to the Bears, but I do just want to say, put some respect on Aiden O'Connell's name.
Not yet.
Okay, let's get to our interior offensive line. And first name on here, because I just do this by snap counts, like the order of the names on here, is a guy who might not even be starting, Coleman Shelton. I did see some reports. It was the high quality reporting of Chicago Bears subreddit, because evidently season ticket holders got the chance to attend OTAs yesterday or 2 days ago. And there was a guy who went on Reddit and said it and gave his notes and said that Shelton was with the ones throughout the OTAs. But the week before, the media all said that Ryan Bates was with the ones. So maybe we got some more competition there than I thought, or maybe it was just an off day for Ryan Bates. Who knows? But either way, I'm starting this off with Shelton, and you brought in Shelton to be a zone run blocker, and that's what he's going to do. I mean, honestly, his gap numbers, his PFF grade in gap concepts came in strong, and he blocked more gap last year. Like Sean McVay took a hard turn towards a lot more duo last year and some more gap concepts. And he blocked well in the gap concepts too. A lot of that's probably as a polar, because he's a tenacious polar. He is an athlete who can move.
Yeah, he is an athlete. That was the one thing I think that jumped off the film watching him after the Bears acquired him during, the free agency period, was he's an athletic center. And I think in today's NFL, that's just more required than it ever was before, where, your center largely was a guy who could just pivot right and pivot left. And that's how you blocked, right? You were a backside blocker in a lot of instances, unless it was a zone concept. Now the center position is asked to do so much more in the NFL that you do have to truly be more of an athlete at the center position. So I think Coleman Shelton was a great addition for a large variety of reasons. Obviously, he's got familiarity with the McVay scheme, and certainly Waldron has concepts of that built into his offense as well. And the numbers are certainly encouraging. I mean, he very clearly is brought in to be competition, right? If it was going to be Bates's job, I don't think they ever bring in Coleman Shelton. I think this was designed on purpose so where that, at the end of the day, you have 4 offensive linemen that can play 3 spots and all be capable starters, between your 2 guard spots and the center spot. And obviously, Shelton being more of a center, it doesn't mean that, he could potentially move the guard in a pinch if you absolutely needed him to.
Yeah, and I'm really interested. I'm gonna pull this up as I'm talking. Actually, Shelton graded out at 88.4 as a zone run blocker, and that's got to be near the top of the league. Like I can't imagine there were many centers who graded out much better than that as a zone blocker. Like that, those are some serious numbers right there.
Yeah, the only one I could probably bet any kind of level of money on that might have outdone him was maybe a Kelsey, but that's about it. I mean, I think the center position in football is it's so underappreciated. And of course, this is coming from a guy that largely played mostly center in his lifetime. But I mean, these guys are athletes. He already has to do a lot as a center. Hell, and in old fake ball coach's offense here back in the good old days. The centers were asked to pull. We were pullers in that offense, and I think you're starting to see it a lot more.
So he ranked 15th in run block grade overall, but 5th in zone run block
centers
grade. Yeah, among centers.
Is that just among centers? Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's something there to say if you have Shelton starting, you can feel pretty confident about your zone run blocking game because at the same time, you've got Teven Jenkins next to him, assuming good health. But Jenkins, one of the best guards as a run blocker. I mean, so in zone run blocking, he was 5th amongst guards at 85.7 for grade. He was actually pretty rough as a gap blocker. I imagine a lot of that comes down to assignment soundness from some teammates and some other stuff. I don't remember a lot of tape from him where I'm going, Teven, what are you doing? And that's what that grade says I should be seeing. But I did see a fair amount of that from the center position, from the other guard position, and some moments where it was Tev and Darnell Wright are next to each other. Darnell Wright's inside shoulder is completely shot, and Tev's having to pick up a lot of slack for Darnell at that point. I can't really blame Darnell there. I'm not going to sit there and tell Teven he did a bad job when he's covering for stuff like that. So I wonder how much that's factoring into the grade there. But outside of that, Teven was the dude last year when he was on the field. I thought, outside of the Week 18 game, you can see the charts down here. These are my grades for these two players, Teven and Nate. Throughout the season, I went and watched every snap, graded every snap. The blue line is pass blocking. The orange line is run blocking. And the gray line is overall grade, which is also impacted by penalties. But you can see pretty clearly there. Teven was consistently grading above 70 for me on the season. He even peaked into the 80s at times. And I think he even had a 290 grades in there where he was playing at an all-pro level, I really do think, last year.
Yeah, he was a true treat to watch. And I think he probably could have gotten a nod at all pro had just the health maybe been a little bit better. And, I think if the Bears were a little bit better, it might have brought a little more notoriety to what he was doing. But I agree with you, man. I mean, Teven Jenkins was that dude for the Bears in every facet of the offensive line game on a unit that was largely insufficient at a lot of the other positions. So he stood out like a sore thumb, but for mostly good reasons because of what he was able to do in both the run and pass game.
The thing that really stood out to me about Teven last year, we know he can run block. We all know he can run block. He can pancake a guy. He can do some stuff athletically that a lot of guards in the NFL can't because he's so big and athletic. Like his size is special for a guard, and that's part of the appeal of playing him at guard he is a difference maker there. But pass protection up until last year had been a question for him at guard. And man, last year, I thought he was better in pass pro than he was as a run blocker. PFF didn't agree with me, but I thought that he was a borderline elite pass protector last year with some of the stuff that he was being asked to do, the way that they were asking him to cover blitzes was borderline insane. Like they'd tell him, get the first guy, push him far enough so he's out of the picture, and then go get the second guy instead of rotating. Like they didn't have the center coming to pick up the guy much of the time. It was a lot more of just Teven, figure it out.
Just do what you can do.
Yeah. And he did it. He did it pretty consistently. Like I thought his pass blocking hit a different level for him last year. And I have a feeling that Teven is going to be one of the best guards in the NFL this year. Like he wants to make money, right?
Yes, he does.
All he has is a second round contract, which is nothing to scoff at, but it's nowhere near the deal that Robert Hunt just got, the deal that Kevin Dotson just got. I think Teven's better than either of those guys. I don't think he's been as consistent, but I think when he's on, he is better than either of those football players. And they're good football players. Don't get me wrong. I thought what we saw from Teven last year, if he could do that for 16 games, he's going to be a very rich man this time next year.
1,000%. I think everybody around the league knows that too, what he can bring and what he can do. It really is. Again, for him, it's just the best ability that he needs to work on is being available. I mean, that really is the biggest knock in his game right now, especially after his third season now in the NFL in 2023. I agree with you. If he does what he did last year or slightly better over the course of maybe he misses one game, we'll call it, maybe two. So he plays at least 15 games of the 17 game slate. I 1,000% agree with you. Whether it's with the Bears or with somebody else, he's going to be handsomely paid by someone for what he can do on the football field.
And I hate that I'm saying this. A part of me just doesn't expect it to be with the Bears, but
I tend to agree.
But we'll see if he. I think he needs to. Or let me ask you this: what do you think Teven needs to do to convince Ryan Poles to pay him a top of the market guard contract this season?
Stay healthy.
Yeah,
that's really all it is. That's nothing more. Like I think, I mean, Ryan Poles was one of the biggest reasons why Teven Jenkins got moved to guard in the first place. I think he saw what the potential was there with Teven being an interior offensive lineman at the next level rather than trying to make him into a tackle that he just wasn't at the NFL level. You know, that they did that intentionally. They knew what kind of football player he could be inside because of that nasty nature that he brought to the game. I'm sure they would love to pay him, but if you can only stay on the field for 12 of 17 or 11 of 17 games every season, you're not going to get paid like a top guard in the NFL. Look at guys like Zach Martin, right? I mean, that dude's on the field every single Sunday and then some.
Doesn't miss
If
time.
he does not, and that's why he's paid so big. Quentin Nelson's the same way, right? And that's why those guys got top of the market dollars. If Teven can play, like I said, if Teven misses a game or two, shit happens, right? But like if he's on the field for at least 15 games this year, I think that's exactly what Ryan Poles needs to see in order to pay him top dollar for being an offensive guard.
So moving on, because I'm with you. I think it's health. If he stays healthy, 16 games, I'll give him one game to miss, maybe two. So 15 plus games.
Yeah.
Performing like he did last year, I think Poles has to consider bringing him back. But if he misses probably 4 games, so we'll say 14 games.
Yeah.
14 games healthy. If it's less than that, I think you are having a really hard time convincing yourself to spend that money. And
100%.
even if it's only 2 games he misses, if those 2 games are neck or back injuries, I think Poles might be out. You know, I mean, or even like abdominal injuries, like core stuff that has to do with your mobility within the center of your body. I think that's where you worry about it. But if he misses 3 games with a broken arm or like a broken hand,
different. Yeah, it's a little different.
You get over it. Like you'll be like, okay, but he played the rest of the games and he was a baller. There was no problem.
And especially just to quickly add, right, like his history of back issues is the biggest piece of that. Because if that comes back to haunt him again, that's where a guy like I think, Poles starts to go, what is his health outlook over the long term? And yeah, these guys are all people. And of course, we'd love to see him get paid as a Bear, but as a GM and a guy that's got a job to do, that's going to be the first question he asks himself is he going to, live up to the return on investment here of what I want to pay him, assuming he could stay healthy, pardon me. But when he's got a long list of those back-related injuries over the course of his short NFL career so far, if that comes back to haunt him this year, it could haunt him in his future with the Bears as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And moving on to a Nate Davis. And Davis, I thought he played somewhat better than his PFF grade for multiple weeks. Like PFF really did not like his season. And I didn't like his season either. I didn't think he was a 26 true pass block grade. Like I had most weeks, I had his grades up around, let me see here. My mouse just went dead on me. All right. So I had his grades for pass blocking most weeks. The first 3 weeks of the season were his 3 best games of the year, as far as I was concerned, where I had him at 68, 69, 69. Nice number
Nice.
there. And then Minnesota game, I had them down at 41, which is ugly.
Oof.
And to be clear, I don't think my grading system goes quite as low as easily as PFF's does either. Like it doesn't go as high as easily or as low. It's a little more forgiving. But and then 62, 68, 61, and then a 39 against Cleveland, 60, 60, and a 51 against Green Bay. So it was very up and down by both standards. I really liked what I saw the first 3 games of the season from him. PFF did not, if I remember correctly, that they thought he was rougher than I did. But I was putting a little more blame on Lucas Patrick for a few things than I think PFF was. But ultimately, I think Nate Davis is going to have a nice bounce back year. I don't think it's going to be a Pro Bowl year. I don't think it's going to be a year where you're like, we got to keep this guy. But I think it's going to be a year where if the Bears decide to move on from him, he still has 20 teams calling him about a starting spot, because that's the position he's in right now. Like, he's in a position where he's saying, if I do not perform, I'm going to have 1 year, $3 million deals at the age of 27 and a half years old. And then I'm going to be looking to get a real contract at 28, because let's see, what's his age? So right now he's 27 and a half. He'll be 28 and a half when he's looking for a 1 year, $4 million deal. He's going to be pushing 30 when he's trying to get another real contract. So this is a contract year for him for all intents and purposes.
100%.
He needs to perform. And at the end of the day, too, guy was 26 years old and his mom passed away right before the season last year. That's going to mess with anyone.
100%.
That's gonna mess anyone up out there, and I think it had to have factored into his play, his practice habits, his real life, his mental health. So, go ahead, Ron.
No, I was just gonna say you absolutely nailed it on the head. I think last year just the offensive line in general was a work in progress for the Bears. You had a rookie right tackle, you had a second-year left tackle, you had a guy that had history of injury issues with Jenkins. Patrick was just not what the team needed a year ago at the center position. And then you factor in the things with Davis. And I think, too, some of that pressure of being the $33 million man to come into Chicago and be that highest paid offensive lineman on the team. I mean, that comes with some pressure as well, especially in a market like with the Chicago Bears. So I'm expecting a bounce back year from Davis. Like you said, I'm not expecting necessarily a Pro Bowl season or an all pro season or anything of that nature. But to your point, right, in a season where I do very much think he's probably a cap casualty, especially if they want to pay a guy like Jenkins or they want to pay some other position in either the offensive or defensive line, I think he will have a good enough season where maybe it's not 20 teams calling him, but maybe it's 15 teams calling him about a starting position at one of the 2 guard spots because of the type of year he had. I think he can get to that. He's shown he can do it. It's just a matter of getting the deal done. And I think having a scheme that'll fit, and there's so many variables that go into it. But I expect Davis to have a bounce back year.
Yeah, I mean, you look at his 3 years prior to last year, he was one of the better zone blocking run blockers in the league. Like he was probably a top 15 guard probably top 20 every year the last 3 years prior to last year as a zone blocker. And then last year his PFF grade in zone blocking fell to 56. Like I think that there is a lot to grow there. And if a Coleman Shelton's at center, his job's gonna get easier as a zone blocker, and he might be really good at it. Like I mean, you think back to Tennessee, who's playing next to Aaron Brewer, I think it was, who's one of the best zone blocking centers in the league, but very similar concept there of, hey, he played next to that guy. That guy was really good at it. He's really good at it. Our interior line becomes a really strong zone blocking unit.
And I was going to say, I think that's the only downfall with individual grades for offensive linemen. It's so much of the line is as a 5-man unit. It's not about one individual man. Maybe a little bit more in pass set, I would say. It's more about the individual and, are they getting beaten by a rush move and things of that nature. But especially in zone, it's a little different if it's inside zone, because you're working stacks, you're working double teams, things of that nature. When you're working outside zone, especially, it truly is a 5-man unit and it's communication based and things like that. If the center can't get the job done and cross the face of the guy that the guard needs to get up to, he's going to be in no man's land, and that's going to look bad on him, even though it might not directly be his fault. So I think that's something that plays into it as well. And to your point, right? If you have Coleman Shelton playing next to him, I bet you just by default of having a higher quality, running mate effectively at center, that's going to bring that grade up immensely next season.
Yeah. And if it's Ryan Bates at center, I still feel pretty good about it because I watched a few games of him at center. I gotta say I'm a little underwhelmed with his center tape, but I still feel pretty good about the ability for him to be a solid zone blocker, especially like you're talking outside zone, like you said, the ability to get out of your stance and get in front of a defender who's crossing your face. There were one or two instances on tape where I felt like Bates struggled with that, but I think that was more about the defender being really good than Bates not being good enough, because Bates is very similar to Coleman Shelton, where he's a very plus athlete who is twitchy up to the second level and twitchy out of his stance. He should be able to cover that well enough to get the time to for the guards to get clear, for him to be able to get in position to at least stalemate guys, and not get blown up as a zone outside zone run blocker. On inside zone, I think both these guys are they're gonna, like I said, twitchy at the second level. Both Shelton and Bates, twitchy at the second level. They're gonna get up there. They're gonna get in the linebacker's face. I wish that Bates, I kept feeling like maybe I think I called it a grip issue when I put it out on Twitter. I'm not sure if that's the right way to put it. I wish that he packed a little more punch, I think, at the second level, because there were just a few times where it was like second level. Some of it was at the line of scrimmage where it was just he didn't get his guy out of position. And I was speaking with someone on Twitter about it, and they're like, well, yeah, it's zone blocking. They just need a stalemate. It didn't sit right with me, that comment, because it was like, yeah, but you want to define the run lane. You want to get some horizontal movement. He's not being an imposing presence to the man in front of him. He's just getting in the way. And that guy is tossing him at times to ruin a play. And sure, some of it's on the running back. Some of it could be on the quarterback. If if running back going the wrong running lane or quarterback starting to scramble, but it was just a hand usage tendency that I didn't love, that I saw from Bates, that I thought Shelton did a much better job of as a run blocker.
He needs to get into a better run fit as a second level, especially as a second level blocker. That's what it is. Because you're talking about grips, right? I mean, that's what you're taught as an offensive lineman, right? If you're working those stacks, especially in zone game, if you're working, let's say you're the center, or well, in this case you're the center, and you're working left and you have a backside one technique, you need to give a hand so your guard can cross his face, right? That's where a Davis and a Jenkins comes in. And then to get up to that second level, you want to be able to fit, you want your head on the outside of that guy's his outside shoulder, so you can get into him and get into your fit and then drive him up the field. And then sometimes that is a little bit of a stalemate, but maybe you are just directing him horizontally versus more so vertically. In the inside zone, where I'm not so worried about guys like Bates and Shelton maybe being a little underwhelming in the inside zone game, is because you get the help of that guard more often than not. There's very few times he's going to be one-on-one with a defensive tackle. Even if he is working, even if it's a weak side run play and it's going to a one technique, that guard and he's going to get a little bit of help, at least from that guard, till he can get his helmet over and get into a proper run fit. And then if at that point it's a stalemate, that's okay. But I think really what you're trying to insinuate is, Bates needs to just get into a better run fit, especially at the second level with these next level defenders, because he has the ability to get there. It's just finishing the job.
Yeah, I think it's just giving a little pop when he gets in that fit, and giving a little being proactive, not reactive.
100%.
And I think that's something that just didn't quite sit right with me with the center tape. I didn't get into his guard tape. He only has 203 snaps at center in the NFL, so it's very limited. there's a comfort level that might be factoring in there. So I need to watch his guard tape still to see if, maybe that's something that isn't as much of an issue as I felt like it was in the center tape. I was just really trying to get a feel for what Poles really loves about this guy.
Sure.
And I think if I'm looking at it very objectively, I think that what he loves about him is what I've been begging the Bears to do with offensive line for the last, 5 years of my life, which is attack athletes with positional versatility. Bates has 200 snaps at center, 300 snaps at left guard, almost 1,000 snaps at right guard, almost 100 snaps at left tackle, and 50 snaps at right tackle. That's something I can get behind. That's something that I don't know if I love it as my starting center at 28 years old, but I do love that versatility, and that athletic profile is there. So I mean, if he's the starting center, I can live with it. If he's your super utility backup, I actually love it.
If Ron Luce was 6'4" and 290 and ran a 4.9 40, that I would be Ryan Bates, because this is what I did in my playing career. I played every single spot on the line and just had that versatility, and that is a valuable thing when you have that guy, especially in the NFL where you aren't carrying a full 5-man unit behind your starters. You need that guy that can step in and play just about every position on the line, because maybe that keeps you from having to carry that 8th offensive lineman, and you can carry an extra special teamer or an extra receiver or something, versus needing that 8th offensive lineman because you have a guy that's only a swing tackle or only a center on the roster.
Yeah. And then so we hadn't talked about Ja'Tyre Carter here yet. Just quick on him. I think that there's some upside there that can be developed. I don't think it's ready to be called a starter or even a swing guy yet, which maybe it's running out of time on it. He's, sitting here at going into his 3rd year. Let's see, 25 years old. So, I mean, if by next year you're not feeling like you're comfortable with him as a true swing, it might just be time to move on. But I do think there's upside that we saw last year, but there's also a lot for him to still learn. He had some real oh no moments last year after having some really nice moments too.
Yeah, it's all balanced. As long as there's some good, you can at least take that player forward and use him as a project and try to work on some of those oh no moments that we saw a year ago.
And then let's get to tackle, because I think we ran a little long on interior there. But Darnell Wright, we all love him. We're all excited about his future. To me, I mean, I look at his graph here, and it's, starts off really high and then moves down, starts to move down a little more, and then comes back up to end the year. It's almost exactly what I feel like I want to see, to a degree, of like, started good, took some lumps, especially once you factor in the injury that he played through, took a few more lumps, but then came back up and ended the season on a high note. I think that he is lining up to be a very good football player for a long time for the Bears. And to me, really, the way that not just the fact that he played through that shoulder injury, like that's admirable. That's great. It's, rah football, tough guy stuff. But he found ways to get the job done despite being severely limited. And to me, that speaks louder than anything, any number you can throw out there, any tape that you can just any clip you can point to, is that the fact that he went out there and found ways to win when he shouldn't be able to win. That is offensive line. Like that is what you look for. That is a guy who just has it, and I am excited about it.
Yeah, I was at that Raiders game when he was playing through that injury, and getting to watch it firsthand was kind of fun, because you got to see some of the creativity with him as just an offensive lineman factor in. How was he getting in front of blockers? How was he using his hands to reposition players? It was a lot of he was just kind of doing what we used to call, when I was in college, just kind of the anchoring technique, where it was just scoot inside, get enough of a hand on the guy, because he's just a big burly grizzly bear. Let's be honest, he's huge. Just get enough of a pop and a pressure on that backside end so he's not able to make a play on the left side and work through it. And then in the zone game coming to his side, it was a lot of work with the guy on that one side, push it off to your guard, and just get to the second level and get your big body in front of somebody and give yourself a chance. I totally agree with you. I think even though it brought his numbers down, quote unquote, at that stretch, it just showed you what you have characteristically. Because offensive lineman is very much of a mindset. You have to be aggressive, but you have to be smart. You have to be agile. You have to be a lot of things to be an elite offensive lineman at the highest level. And Darnell Wright is showcasing a lot of those skill sets that I think, like you said, Bears fans should be excited about moving forward, because I think Darnell Wright's going to be a staple of the Chicago Bears team for probably the next 10 to 15 years if he continues to play like he did as a rookie.
Yeah. And I think one thing that is like, there are some things in like, maybe not necessarily football, but just in like in everyday life, it's like you can find a way to do something and you can just do it that way over and over and stay successful. Blocking Max Crosby is not one of them.
No, it's not.
So when you lose an arm and you have to find ways to have variety, that's a very difficult task, and he was up to it. And that that stands out to me in loud capital letters. But Braxton Jones, man, I was so excited after week 1 about Braxton, because it was like, this guy played like he was outstanding. And that's one of the saddest parts about that Green Bay game last year. Both tackles played so well. Like I had Wright in a high 80s grade for that game, and I had Jones in a mid 90s pass block grade. The penalties killed his grade, brought down to a 70, but the fact that his pass block grade was that high was so promising to me. And I wasn't alone in that. Like, I go to PFF, I'm pulling PFF up right now to see. I know that they were high on him after that game. They gave him an 89.9 pass block grade. Like, so I was eye to eye with them on what happened in that game with Braxton Jones. And it was just so promising, but he never hit near that grade again the rest of the season.
I wonder if some of that was just because of the nature of the injury he sustained and just not being able to get the full health in time. You know, he was out for quite a while, and I don't even think he was truly fully healthy when he got back. I think that really was just one of those instances where if you're Ryan Poles, you look at his body of work over the season and just go, that injury really, really hurt him. Like, not just physically, but just in terms of development, in terms of so many other factors than just his play on the field and the time he missed. I think coming into this season, this will be, assuming he can stay healthy, this will be the body of work where we can finally say, hey, what is Braxton Jones as an offensive tackle in the NFL? And again, obviously a lot of that plays into staying healthy, but if he's able to stay healthy and even be 80% of what he was in that Packers game, the Bears are set at both tackle spots for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm at a point where I'm questioning how much of that is, you know, is Braxton a guy that you really would feel comfortable paying? And he's going to answer that question this year, right? Like, that's
100%.
That's not a question that needs to be answered now, but it's something that I'm hesitant to fall into, I guess, until we see something more definitive. Because if the injury wasn't a neck injury last year, I could live with it more. But like, I look at Teven, who had back issues and neck issues, and he lost some of his core mobility, some of his core flexibility. Braxton was not the same football player down the stretch last year. His core flexibility, his ability to turn and still have power to be reactive, it was much more robotic, right? It was much more, my head is facing where my body faces. Like,
he was Batman.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was looking for. Yes, I was like, I know there's a reference for this.
He was Batman.
Yeah. And if he can get that flexibility back this year, awesome, great. It could go very far. But I start to worry about, you know, what are the lasting impacts of that injury that could be there? Is it recurring? Because it impacted his play pretty heavily last year.
Same concern that we have for Teven Jenkins as well, right? So absolutely, a lot of questions to be answered here in year 3 for Braxton Jones.
Yeah. And then behind the two starters, you got the rookie third-round pick, Karan Emagaji. I don't foresee him playing much tackle this year unless one of these two starters goes down, then maybe you'll see him. But I could see a world where Teven or Nate Davis go down. You don't want to mess with who's starting at center if it's Bates, and you say Karan can play guard.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think the most logical path there is, say, put Shelton in at center and put Bates at guard. But if I thoroughly understand the idea of like, hey, we don't want to mess with the center quarterback exchange. We want that chemistry to stay the same. Karan's going in at right guard because Nate Davis went down, or left guard because Teven went down, and we're going to see what we got in this kid.
Yeah, I think there's a real possibility of that too, because especially for this year, right? Maybe he's a guy that fills in at guard, but maybe down the road, maybe he is the heir apparent to Braxton Jones at left tackle if Jones isn't fully healthy. I think Amagaji's ability to be nasty, like you saw it on his film. He has good placement of his hands for how big he is and how long he is. I think he's absolutely a guy that can use that skill set, kick inside, and do a good enough job as a first year rookie at the next level, and then again potentially continue building into that. Maybe it's a tackle of the future, but again, having that versatility that we talked about, right? Q, of being able to play multiple spots is going to be so crucial for this team moving forward.
Interesting though, as you're saying that, I'm just thinking the most ideal thing for Amagaji is probably not playing this year.
Agreed.
And just getting the coached up on hand technique, hand placement, hand speed. I think hand speed is going to be very key for him to speed up, because some of his punches I felt like were late and were slow to get out, had a bit of a wind up at times. And if he's playing guard, I could see it becoming a Kyle Long type thing where he is just relying on his body and his frame to block people and never quite gets his hands right. I think getting a full season of him growing his hand technique can go a long way towards his prospect as a tackle, whereas throwing him in at guard might just result in him being a guard because he never gets that hand technique right.
Yeah, incredibly well said. That is exactly my thought with Amagaji this year too. Is his best case scenario is he doesn't play at all.
Mm-hmm. And then behind him, you got, in line with him, however you want to look at it, you got Larry Borum, you got Jake Curran, you got Matt Pryor. Jake Curran was in Seattle with Shane Waldron last year. Did some nice stuff as a run blocker, was really rough as a pass blocker, according to PFF. Was rougher than Borum, actually, according to the grades, which is, we don't love Borum. I think Borum is probably a fine swing tackle across the league, but he's not a guy who you're like, oh, we got good depth here. He's a guy who's like, you can play him.
You're a warm body that'll get the job done, but I agree.
And then Matt Pryor, I believe, has a fair amount of experience in the league. I could be mistaken on that.
He does, but I don't think it was much in 2023. I believe a lot of it came in like 2021 and 2022.
So he didn't play much in 2023, but in San Fran, they didn't run into any injuries there. But prior to that, get it. But in Indy in 22, he played almost 600 snaps. He was well below average in PFF grades. But the year before that, in 21 in Indy, he was above average in all his grades with almost 450 snaps. So he's a guy who in the right, I bet you scheme and system, like 22, I guess it was probably, 22. That was the Jeff Saturday year in Indy. So that was a mess. And that was the worst year of his career. I would bet you that he's probably a lot closer to his career averages than he was in 2022, because in 2022, that Indy team was just, who knows what they were doing on offense. Like the playbook changed halfway through the year.
Yeah, it was a gong show, to say the least.
Yeah. But in 21, he had the best year of his career at Indy, posting a 76.5 PFF grade. I mean, this is one of Ian Cunningham's guys. Ian Cunningham drafted this guy. I think he is your most likely swing here. And he's got experience at guard too. So left tackle, right tackle, and right guard. He has significant experience a little bit of experience at left guard as well. This is your super utility guy who can play tackle and guard. I think he's going to be your first guy off the bench outside of like a Coleman Shelton or Ryan Bates, who might be first off for an interior spot.
Yeah, I think really when it comes down to it, if you look at the 7 or 8 offensive linemen that are going to make this roster, it's going to be Jenkins, it's going to be Bates, it's going to be Shelton, it's going to be Davis, probably a Jatir Carter, and then you're probably looking at Darnell Wright, Braxton Jones, and realistically, Amagaji and then Pryor are probably your guys there. So I think there's a world where Jatir Carter, especially if Pryor shows he can play guard and maybe Amagaji shows he can play a little bit of guard this year, I think there's a world where Jatir Carter is just kind of the odd man out in that interior offensive line room. And, they run with some of these guys that maybe are a little bit more of a swing guard tackle type guy on the roster, knowing you have 2 guys on the interior that can admirably play center in Bates and Shelton.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going through this, who are because how many active guys do you think they keep?
I would say probably 8.
8. Who are the 8 guys that you would trust to protect Caleb Williams on these 2 lists? Whichever one you want first.
I would say here it's Shelton, Jenkins, Davis, Bates. So that's 4. And then you're taking 4 from this list. And to me, that's Wright, Jones, Pryor, and Amagaji. So I really do think Jatir Carter, Larry Borum, Jay Curran might just be simply the odd man out because of how the roster will probably shake out.
If you're going to get wild with it and keep 9, who's the 9th?
Probably Curran, just because of his experience with Waldron. I think that makes a lot of sense. Unless they really love the progress. Because, again, we haven't been at OTAs. We haven't been sitting watching the offensive line closely coming into the season now. But if Jatir Carter's putting good things on film for this coaching staff, I would argue it's a 2-man race between he and Curran. I just unfortunately think Larry Borum it's a numbers game. And I think Borum's going to be probably that first guy that's, hey, we appreciate your time here and what you've done. But, it's a numbers game and we just can't afford to keep you anymore.
Yeah. And Curran makes some sense. He's been with Waldron the last 3 years. He was Waldron. He came into the league under Waldron. He's played 738 snaps at the NFL level, mostly at right tackle, but he has played a little bit of guard and a little bit left guard and right guard. So
there you go. Another guy that could fit that Pryor. I think it could be a 2-man race between he and Pryor for the last spot on the offensive line, to be brutally honest with you.
But history says you cannot kill Larry Borum.
I guess we'll have to wait and see, right? what happens with Larry Borum. But I mean, hey, you never know. There also could be a world where Larry Borum becomes a hot commodity if there's an injury on a team, and maybe Ryan Poles is able to leverage him for some late draft capital next season. We saw how much draft capital the Bears gave up throughout the year for guys like Dan Feeney and some of these others that came in just because of all the injuries. Who's to say another team doesn't go through something very similar this year?
Who knows? But I think that'll wrap it up for us, Ron. Do you have any final thoughts you want to get out there?
Love talking about the fat boys. Love talking about tight ends. I think the tight end room is going to be a lot of fun this year. And I think the offensive line is going to be significantly better. And those are both good things for rookie quarterback, Mr. Caleb Williams. So I am very excited for the fall, Q, and seeing what these Hogs put on tape.
Me too, Ron. In the meantime, make sure to go over to ontapsportsnet.com. We'll have a write-up discussing all the stuff that we talked about here. Make sure to go back and check out the wide receiver write-up, the running back write-up. We're going through every position. We're going to have an article for every position, and we're doing 2 positions per week on this podcast. So make sure to stay tuned for it. While you're at ontapsportsnet.com, make sure to check out the Cubs, White Sox, Bulls, Blackhawks, gambling content, golf. We got everything over there. We got Chicago Fire as well. And thank you guys for listening. Ron, you want to take us away?
Bear down, baby.
Bear down.